The morning sun cast long shadows over the parched earth of Canon City, Colorado. As Rebecca Faulkner stood on the weathered porch of her small homestead, her knuckles white around the handle of a cracked porcelain cup. The year was 1878, and the cruel summer had brought nothing but drought and despair to her door. But it wasn't the failing crops or dwindling supplies that haunted her eyes, it was something deeper. A pain etched into the very lines of her face that seemed to age her beyond her 24 years. "Rebecca, you need to stop this foolishness," Martha Wilkins called from the dirt path leading to the modest cabin. The older woman carried a basket of preserves, her weekly offering of charity that Rebecca both needed and resented. "The town's talking. It's been 3 years since James passed. You can't keep living like this." Rebecca's throat tightened. "Thank you for the preserves, Martha," she said, deliberately ignoring the rest of the woman's words. How could she explain that James's death was only where her pain had begun, not where it had ended? Martha sighed, setting the basket on the porch railing. "The Reverend's wife is looking for help with the children. It would do you good to be around people again." Rebecca nodded, the motion automatic. She'd heard it all before. Get out more, find a new husband, move on. As if the darkness that gripped her heart was merely a stubborn stain that needed the right scrubbing. "I'll think about it," she lied. After Martha left, Rebecca returned to the small vegetable plot behind her home. The soil was dry and cracked, much like her own spirit. She'd been trying to coax life from this patch of earth for months. But the garden, like everything else in her life, seemed determined to wither and die. 3 miles west of Rebecca's struggling homestead, Finn O'Rourke guided his horse through the rocky terrain that led to Canon City. At 31, he'd spent more than half his life in the saddle, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, taking odd jobs where he could find them. His latest employment with the Bar M Ranch had ended when the operation was bought out by a larger outfit from back east. Now, with nothing but his horse, his gear, and a modest sum in his pocket, Finn was heading to Canon City in search of work. The town appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden structures shimmering in the heat. Finn had heard that the railroads were pushing through this part of Colorado, bringing with them opportunities for men who weren't afraid of hard work. The mountains that loomed in the distance promised mines, and the towns that sprouted around them were always in need of strong backs. As Finn rode down the main street, he took note of the establishments: a general store, a couple of saloons, a hotel that had seen better days, and a small church whose white paint was peeling under the relentless sun. It wasn't much different from dozens of other frontier towns he'd passed through, but something about Canon City made him rein in his horse and take a second look. "New in town?" The question came from a man sweeping the boardwalk in front of the mercantile. "Just arrived," Finn answered, dismounting. "Name's Finn O'Rourke, looking for work if there's any to be had." The man leaned on his broom, sizing Finn up with a practiced eye. "Samuel Guthrie. I own this establishment, don't know about steady work, but Jenkins over at the livery might need help." Been complaining about his back acting up again. Finn nodded his thanks and led his horse toward the livery stable. By sundown, he'd secured not only a job helping the aging stable master, but also a small room above the livery in exchange for additional duties. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning found Rebecca in town, reluctantly fulfilling her promise to Martha to speak with the Reverend's wife. The streets were busier than usual, with a supply wagon having arrived the previous evening. As she made her way toward the church, she kept her eyes downcast, avoiding the pitying glances of townspeople who'd long ago decided she was a lost cause. "Watch out." The warning came too late as Rebecca collided with a solid form, sending her small basket of eggs crashing to the ground. "I am so sorry, madam," a deep voice said as strong hands steadied her. "I wasn't looking where I was going." Rebecca looked up into the face of a stranger, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His hat was off, clutched in one hand, revealing dark hair in need of a trim. "It's fine," she muttered, bending to gather the remains of her basket. "They were just eggs. Please let me replace them," the man insisted, crouching down beside her. "I'm Finn O'Rourke, just started working at the livery." "Rebecca Faulkner," she replied automatically, then felt a flush of irritation at herself for engaging in conversation. "There's no need. They were from my own hens." Finn picked up a broken shell, his expression genuinely contrite. "Then I owe you hens some apologies, and you a new basket at the very least." Despite herself, Rebecca almost smiled at his earnestness. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her without the undercurrent of pity or judgment. "Really, Mr. O'Rourke, it's nothing," she insisted, rising to her feet and brushing dust from her skirt. The movement triggered a sharp pain in her side, a reminder of old injuries that had never quite healed properly. She winced, hoping he wouldn't notice. But Finn's observant eyes caught the grimace. "Are you hurt, Miss Faulkner? Did I knock you down harder than I thought?" "It's Mrs.," she corrected reflexively. "And no, it's nothing." She turned to leave, suddenly desperate to escape his scrutiny. "Well, Mrs. Faulkner," Finn called after her, "I still owe you for those eggs. I'll be at the livery if you change your mind." Rebecca hurried away, uncomfortable with the interaction. She'd become so accustomed to isolation that even a simple conversation left her feeling exposed, as if the cowboy might somehow see through her carefully constructed walls to the brokenness within. She didn't make it to the church that day. Instead, she returned home, telling herself it was because of the lost eggs, not because of the unsettling encounter with Finn O'Rourke. Days passed, and Rebecca avoided town as much as possible. She tended her small flock of chickens, worked in her struggling garden, and tried to ignore the persistent ache that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in her body and soul. But Canon City was too small for complete avoidance. A week after their first meeting, Rebecca encountered Finn again at the general store where she'd gone to trade eggs for flour. "Mrs. Faulkner," he greeted her with a tip of his hat. "I was beginning to think you'd disappeared." "Mr. O'Rourke," she acknowledged stiffly. Samuel Guthrie watched their interaction with interest from behind the counter. "You two know each other. We had a brief encounter involving some unfortunate eggs," Finn explained with a smile. "Finn here's become quite popular around town," Samuel remarked. "Fixed up Jenkins's roof, helped the widow Simmons with her wagon. Been making himself useful." Rebecca nodded politely, wishing the transaction would hurry along so she could leave. "Actually, I've been meaning to ask," Finn said, addressing Rebecca directly. "I heard you might have a well on your property. Jenkins mentioned it needs clearing, said the late spring floods might have contaminated it." Rebecca tensed. Her well had indeed been giving her trouble, the water coming up cloudy and tasting of earth. But the thought of this stranger or anyone coming to her homestead made her stomach knot with anxiety. "I can manage," she said curtly. Samuel gave a small cough. "Rebecca, wells aren't something to fool with. If it's contaminated, you could get sick." "Finn knows what he's doing, worked on a few ranches with water problems." Rebecca felt cornered. She needed clean water, and the trip to town to fetch it was becoming increasingly difficult with her chronic pain. Still, the thought of someone invading her sanctuary. "I can pay you," she finally offered, making it clear this would be a business arrangement and nothing more. Finn shook his head. "No need. Consider it recompense for the eggs and basket. I'll come by tomorrow if that suits." Unable to think of a reasonable objection, Rebecca agreed, giving him directions to her homestead before hurrying out of the store. The next day, she rose before dawn, anxiety having prevented much sleep. She tidied the small cabin, hiding away anything too personal, and waited on the porch, her body tense with apprehension. Finn arrived mid-morning, leading a mule laden with tools. He wore a worn work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle. "Morning, Mrs. Faulkner," he called cheerfully. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Rebecca nodded, the pleasantry feeling foreign on her tongue. "The well is this way," she said, leading him around the side of the cabin. Finn assessed the well, which was set against a small rise in the land. "Looks like runoff from the hill might be seeping in," he observed. "I'll need to check the lining, see if there are any cracks or breaks." For the next few hours, Rebecca watched from a distance as Finn worked. He removed stones from the well's circular wall, examined them, and carefully replaced them after applying a sealing mixture he'd brought along. He worked methodically, occasionally talking to himself or to the mule, which grazed nearby. When noon came, Rebecca reluctantly invited him to take his midday meal on the porch. She brought out bread, cheese, and some dried apple slices, simple fare, but all she had to offer. "This is mighty kind of you," Finn said, accepting the plate with genuine gratitude. "I've been eating Jenkins's cooking for the past week. The man means well, but he believes salt is the only seasoning necessary in this world." A small smile tugged at Rebecca's lips before she could suppress it. "You didn't have to take on his cooking along with the job." "Part of the arrangement for the room," Finn explained, biting into the bread. "Though I'm beginning to think I got the raw end of that deal." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the tension gradually easing from Rebecca's shoulders. There was something about Finn's straightforward manner that didn't demand conversation, but didn't make silence uncomfortable either. "You have a nice place here," he commented, looking out at the dusty yard and struggling garden. "Needs water, though. Once we get the well fixed up, your garden will do better." "You know about gardening?" Rebecca asked, surprised. "My mother kept a garden back in Missouri," Finn replied. "Taught me a thing or two before I left home. Your soil looks good, just parched." The mention of his mother prompted Rebecca to ask, "How long have you been away from home?" 15 years, give or take. "Left when I was 16, worked my way west with cattle drives, then up through Texas and into the territories." He glanced at her. "What about you?" "You're not from around here originally, are you? I detect a hint of the East in your speech." Rebecca stiffened, regretting the moment of normalcy. "Pennsylvania," she said shortly. But that was a long time ago. Sensing her withdrawal, Finn didn't press. He finished his meal, thanked her, and returned to work on the well. By late afternoon, he had resealed the upper portion of the well and fashioned a better cover to prevent future contamination. "It'll take a day or two for the sealant to set properly," he explained. "Then the water should run clear again. I'd be happy to come back and check on it, make sure everything's working as it should." Rebecca wanted to refuse, to tell him she could manage on her own as she always had. But the truth was, she needed the well to function, and she couldn't fix it herself. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling rusty in her mouth. "That would be acceptable," Finn nodded, gathering his tools. As he loaded them onto the mule, Rebecca noticed him wince slightly, his hand going to his lower back. "Are you hurt?" she asked before she could stop herself. Finn straightened, looking embarrassed. "Old injury. Acts up now and then when I've been bending too long. Nothing serious." Rebecca knew what it was to live with persistent pain, to hide it from others who wouldn't understand. The realization that this strong, capable man carried his own burden of suffering created an unexpected moment of connection. "I have some willow bark tea," she heard herself saying. "It helps with pain sometimes." Surprise flickered across Finn's face, followed by gratitude. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Faulkner, but I don't want to impose any further." "It's no imposition," she insisted, surprising herself with the sincerity in her voice. "Please, come inside for a moment." The interior of Rebecca's cabin was simple but meticulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a small table and 2 chairs positioned nearby. A curtain separated what must have been a sleeping area from the main room. Various herbs hung drying from the ceiling beams, evidence of Rebecca's knowledge of natural remedies. She busied herself preparing the tea, aware of Finn's presence in a way that made her movements feel stiff and self-conscious. When she handed him the steaming cup, their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unexpected jolt through her. "Thank you," Finn said, his voice lower than before. He sipped the bitter tea without complaint. "You seem to know your way around herbs and such." Rebecca nodded, taking a seat across from him. My grandmother was skilled with plants. She taught me what she knew. Useful knowledge out here, Finn commented. Doctors are few and far between. Yes, she agreed, then hesitated before adding, I've found that most ailments can be treated if you know what to look for in nature. They talked a bit longer about medicinal plants that grew in the area, with Rebecca gradually becoming more animated as she shared her knowledge. It had been so long since she'd had a conversation that wasn't laden with pity or advice she hadn't asked for. As the sun began to set, Finn rose to leave. I'll come back in a couple of days to check on the well, he promised. Thank you for the tea, my back's feeling better already. After he left, Rebecca stood in the doorway watching his figure disappear down the dirt path. A complex mixture of emotions swirled within her: anxiety at having let someone into her space, relief that it hadn't been as difficult as she'd feared, and a strange, almost forgotten feeling that might have been a flicker of interest in another human being. She quickly quashed that last sentiment. She'd learned the hard way that connection led to vulnerability, and vulnerability led to pain. Better to remain alone than to risk being hurt again. True to his word, Finn returned 2 days later to check on the well. The water ran clear, and Rebecca found herself genuinely grateful for his help. Is there anything else you need fixed around here? He asked, looking around the property with a handyman's eye. That porch railing looks like it's seen better days. Rebecca's instinct was to refuse, to send him on his way and return to her solitude. But the truth was, there were many small repairs that needed attention, tasks she couldn't manage herself due to her physical limitations. I can't pay you, she said, the admission difficult for her pride. Finn considered for a moment. How about a trade? I fix what needs fixing, and you teach me more about those herbs and remedies of yours. Jenkins isn't the only one who could use some help with aches and pains. It was a reasonable proposal, one that would maintain the boundary of a business arrangement while allowing her to contribute something of value. After a moment's hesitation, Rebecca agreed. Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. Finn would come to Rebecca's homestead on his days off from the livery, working on various repairs while she tended her garden or prepared meals. After the work was done, they would sit on the porch while Rebecca shared her knowledge of medicinal plants, explaining their properties and how to prepare them. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Rebecca began to relax in Finn's presence. He never pressed her for personal information, never commented on her obvious desire for privacy. Instead, he filled the silences with stories of his travels, descriptions of the places he'd seen, and the characters he'd encountered on the trail. There was this one old trail cook, Finn recounted one evening as they sat watching the sunset, who swore that the secret to his beans was that he never washed the pot. Said it built up flavor over time. We used to joke that his pot hadn't seen water since the Mexican War. Rebecca found herself smiling more often, sometimes even laughing at Finn's tales. Each time it happened, she felt a mixture of pleasure and guilt, as if she were betraying something by finding moments of joy. As summer progressed into early fall, the repair work on Rebecca's homestead was nearly complete. The porch was sturdy again, the chicken coop reinforced against predators, the roof patched where it had leaked during the spring rains. Rebecca's garden, benefiting from the clean well water, was producing a modest harvest that she carefully preserved for the winter months ahead. But as the work neared its end, Rebecca found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. She didn't want the arrangement to end. Finn's visits had become a bright spot in her otherwise solitary existence. The prospect of returning to complete isolation filled her with a dread she hadn't anticipated. Finn, too, seemed reluctant for their association to conclude. One afternoon, as he finished repairing a broken hinge on her door, he cleared his throat awkwardly. Mrs. Faulkner, Rebecca, if I may, there's a harvest dance in town next Saturday. I was wondering if you might consider attending, with me. Rebecca froze, the invitation catching her completely off guard. A dance, people, gossip. The thought sent waves of anxiety through her body. I don't dance, she said stiffly, the words coming out harsher than she'd intended. Finn's expression fell slightly, but he nodded with understanding. Of course, it was just a thought. An uncomfortable silence settled between them, the first in many weeks. Rebecca felt a pang of regret, knowing she'd hurt him with her abrupt refusal. But how could she explain that the thought of being surrounded by the judgmental eyes of the townspeople, their whispers following her every move, was more than she could bear? It's not that I don't. She began, then faltered. I'm not good with crowds, not anymore. Finn's eyes softened. I understand, truly. Sometimes it's easier to be alone. But the way he said it made Rebecca wonder if he was speaking from his own experience rather than simply accommodating her preferences. The realization that this man who seemed so at ease with others might also know the pain of isolation created another unexpected moment of connection between them. Perhaps. She ventured hesitantly, perhaps we could take a ride instead. There's a spot by the river I sometimes visit. It's quiet there. The smile that illuminated Finn's face was answer enough. I'd like that very much. The following Saturday, instead of the harvest dance, Finn arrived at Rebecca's homestead with his horse and a borrowed mare for her to ride. The day was perfect for an outing, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of autumn's approach. They rode in comfortable silence, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of cottonwood trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn golden. The river came into view, a ribbon of silver cutting through the landscape. Rebecca led the way to a small clearing beside a bend in the river, where a fallen log provided a natural seat. I found this place shortly after I arrived in Canon City, she explained as they dismounted. I come here when I need space. Finn nodded, understanding the significance of her sharing this private sanctuary with him. He helped her spread a small blanket on the ground, then unpacked the lunch he'd brought: freshly baked bread, cheese, and early apples from the orchard outside town. As they ate, Rebecca found herself more relaxed than she'd been in years. The rushing sound of the river, the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, and Finn's undemanding companionship created a sense of peace she'd thought lost forever. May I ask you something, Rebecca? Finn's voice broke the silence gently. She tensed slightly but nodded, bracing herself for the inevitable questions about her past, her husband, her isolation. What's your favorite time of day? He asked instead. The unexpected question startled a genuine laugh from her. That's what you want to know, Finn smiled, pleased at the sound of her laughter. For now, I figure we all have stories we don't want to tell. I'm more interested in knowing who you are today than who you were yesterday. Rebecca considered the question seriously. Dawn, I think. When everything is quiet and new, before the weight of the day settles in. She looked at him curiously. And yours? Dusk, he replied without hesitation. That moment when the work is done but the night hasn't fully arrived. When you can sit and catch your breath and feel like you've earned your rest. They continued exchanging simple questions and answers: favorite foods, best books they'd read, places they'd like to visit someday. The conversation flowed naturally, without pressure or expectation, building a bridge of small connections between them. As the afternoon waned, Finn skipped stones across the water's surface, teaching Rebecca the technique when she admitted she'd never tried it before. Her first attempt sank immediately, but under his patient guidance, she eventually managed to skip a stone twice across the river's surface. I did it, she exclaimed, the childlike delight in her voice surprising them both. Finn smiled warmly at her. You're a natural. The moment of triumph was accompanied by a sudden twinge in Rebecca's side, a sharp reminder of old injuries. She winced, her hand automatically going to the spot beneath her ribs. Finn noticed immediately. Are you all right? Yes, just an old pain, she said, straightening with effort. It happens sometimes when I move a certain way. Finn's eyes filled with concern, but he didn't press for details. Instead, he suggested gently, perhaps we should head back before the light fades too much. The ride home was slower, with Rebecca struggling to hide her discomfort. By the time they reached her homestead, the pain had intensified to a dull, persistent throb that made dismounting difficult. Finn was there instantly, strong hands carefully supporting her as her feet touched the ground. "Thank you," she murmured, embarrassed by her weakness. "You don't need to thank me," Finn replied, his voice low. "And you don't need to pretend you're not hurting, Rebecca. Not with me." Something in his tone, the absence of pity, the simple acknowledgement of her pain without trying to fix it or dismiss it, broke through a layer of Rebecca's defenses. Tears welled unexpectedly in her eyes, and she turned away quickly, not wanting him to see. But Finn gently turned her back to face him, his hand warm against her cheek. "It's all right," he said softly. "Whatever it is, it's all right. The dam broke." 3 years of isolated grief, of physical and emotional pain endured alone, suddenly overwhelmed Rebecca. She found herself sobbing against Finn's chest, his arms around her, providing the first real comfort she'd known since her world had shattered. He didn't try to hush her or tell her things would get better. He simply held her, a solid presence in the storm of her emotions, until the worst of the tears had passed. When she finally stepped back, wiping her eyes with embarrassment, Finn didn't let her retreat completely. He kept one hand lightly on her arm, an anchor to the present moment. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice raw. "I don't usually." "Don't apologize for feeling, Rebecca," Finn interrupted gently. "We all carry burdens, some are just heavier than others." Rebecca looked up at him, seeing in his eyes a depth of understanding that couldn't come from mere sympathy. "You speak like someone who knows." Finn nodded, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "I've had my share of dark days, still do sometimes. That's why I keep moving, I suppose." Hard for the darkness to catch you when you're always one step ahead. The simple admission created a new level of connection between them. Rebecca realized that Finn's easygoing manner and ready smile might be as much of a protective mask as her own isolation, different strategies for surviving wounds that hadn't fully healed. "Would you like to come in?" she asked, the invitation more meaningful than it appeared on the surface. "I could make some tea." Inside the cabin, with night falling around them, Rebecca lit a lamp and moved around the small space with practiced efficiency, setting water to boil and measuring dried herbs into a pot. Finn sat at the table, his tall frame making the modest furniture seem smaller. As she handed him a steaming cup, Rebecca made a decision. It had been so long since she'd trusted anyone, but something about Finn made her want to try again. "My husband didn't die in an accident," she said quietly, taking the seat across from him. "That's what everyone in town believes, but it's not true." Finn remained silent, his steady gaze encouraging her to continue at her own pace. "James and I came west for a fresh start. He'd lost his position at a bank in Philadelphia, and there was talk of improprieties. I believed him when he said he'd been falsely accused." Rebecca's hands tightened around her cup. "We settled here, built this place together. For a while it was good, or I thought it was." She took a deep breath, the words coming more difficultly now. "But James had demons I didn't understand. When he drank, he became someone else entirely. Someone, cruel, understanding dawned in Finn's eyes, but still he didn't interrupt. The first time he struck me, he wept afterwards, swore it would never happen again. I believed him." Rebecca's voice had gone flat, detached, as if she were telling someone else's story. "The second time I tried to leave, he broke 2 of my ribs, stopping me." Finn's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. "It went on for nearly a year. I became skilled at hiding bruises, explaining away injuries. No one in town suspected James was charming in public, well-liked. I was just the quiet Eastern wife who didn't fit in." Rebecca's gaze dropped to the table. "The last night, he'd lost money gambling, more than we could afford. When I confronted him, he came at me with a fire poker. Finn's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. I don't remember exactly what happened," Rebecca continued, her voice barely above a whisper now. "There was a struggle, the poker, he fell, hit his head on the hearth. By the time I gathered my wits enough to try to help him, he was gone." She looked up at Finn, bracing herself for judgment or disgust. The sheriff ruled it an accident, a tragic mishap. No one knew about the other things, and I couldn't bring myself to tell them, not even then. So everyone pitied the poor widow while you carried the burden alone, Finn finished for her, his voice gentle but firm. The pain of what he did to you and the pain of his death. Rebecca nodded, tears streaming silently down her face now. I keep waiting to feel free, to feel relief that it's over. But the pain never leaves, not the physical pain from the injuries that didn't heal right, and not the other kind. Sometimes I think it never will. Finn reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Rebecca, look at me. She raised her eyes reluctantly. What happened wasn't your fault, not what he did to you, and not how it ended. You were defending yourself from someone who had sworn to protect you but became your tormentor instead. The words, the absolution she had been unable to grant herself, broke through another layer of Rebecca's defenses. Fresh tears came, but these felt different somehow, cleansing rather than devastating. Finn moved his chair around the table, close enough to put his arm around her shoulders, offering comfort without expectation or demand. They sat like that for a long time, the lamp burning low as Rebecca's tears gradually subsided. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice steadier. "For listening, for not what? For not telling me I need to get over it, or that time heals all wounds, or any of the other platitudes people offer when they don't understand." Finn's expression was solemn. "Pain doesn't work like that. It doesn't follow anyone else's schedule. It takes the time it takes." As he rose to leave, promising to check on her the next day, Rebecca felt something shift inside her, not a miraculous healing or sudden freedom from the past, but a small opening, a crack in the walls she'd built around herself, through which a thin beam of light now shone. Over the following weeks, that opening gradually widened. Rebecca began accompanying Finn on rides through the countryside, discovering parts of the surrounding area she'd never explored. They took picnic lunches to the river spot, where Finn continued teaching her to skip stones, each successful attempt bringing genuine smiles to her face. October arrived, painting the landscape in rich autumn colors. Rebecca's garden yielded its final harvest, which she preserved for the winter ahead. Finn helped her chop and stack firewood, ensuring she would have enough to last through the cold months. With each passing day, Rebecca found herself sharing more of her thoughts and feelings with Finn. She told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her parents who had passed away before she married James, her dreams of someday becoming a healer. In turn, Finn spoke of his family back in Missouri, the father whose harsh discipline had driven him away at 16, the mother and sisters he still wrote to occasionally but hadn't seen in years. One crisp afternoon, as they rode together along a ridge overlooking Canon City, Finn reined his horse to a stop. "I've been offered a job," he said, his expression unreadable. Rebecca felt a sudden cold dread in the pit of her stomach. "Oh, ranch foreman over near Pueblo. Good pay, stable position." Rebecca nodded, struggling to maintain her composure. Of course he would move on eventually. That was what Finn did. He never stayed in one place too long. She'd known this from the beginning. "That sounds like a good opportunity," she managed to say, her voice carefully controlled. "When would you start?" "That depends," Finn replied, turning in his saddle to face her directly. "On what you want, Rebecca." The unexpected response left her momentarily speechless. "What I want. I've been thinking about what you told me about James, about what happened, about how no one believed your pain or even knew about it." Finn's eyes held her steadily. "I believe you, Rebecca. I see your strength, your courage, and I care for you. More than I've cared for anyone in a very long time." Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest. "Finn, you don't need to say anything now," he interrupted gently. "I know this isn't simple, but I want you to know that I'm not taking that job unless you tell me to go. I'd rather stay here in Canon City. With you, if that's what you want too." The declaration hung in the air between them, profound in its simplicity. Rebecca looked at this man who had, quietly and without fanfare, become the most important person in her life. The thought of him leaving filled her with a pain different from but no less intense than what she'd carried these past years. "I don't know if I can be what you deserve," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the autumn wind. "I'm still broken in so many ways." Finn moved his horse closer to hers, reaching across to take her hand. "We're all broken in some way, Rebecca, but maybe, just maybe, the broken pieces can fit together to make something new, something whole." Tears blurred Rebecca's vision, but these weren't tears of grief or pain. They were tears of possibility, of hope cautiously reawakening after a long dormancy. "I don't want you to go," she whispered. The smile that illuminated Finn's face chased away the last of the autumn chill. "Then I'll stay." They rode back to Rebecca's homestead as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the land. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer empty. There would be challenges ahead, Rebecca knew. Her healing had only just begun, and there would be dark days still to face. But for the first time in years, she wouldn't face them alone. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Canon City in snow before Thanksgiving. Rebecca and Finn were married in a small ceremony at the church, attended by the few townspeople who had never given up on the quiet widow Martha Wilkins, Samuel Guthrie, old Jenkins from the livery. They expanded Rebecca's cabin, adding a second room and reinforcing the structure against the harsh Colorado winters. Finn continued working at the livery, having been promoted to manager when Jenkins decided to retire to his sister's home in Denver. As the long winter nights closed in around them, Rebecca and Finn would sit before the fire, talking of their plans for the spring: a larger garden, perhaps some cattle, maybe even the beginnings of the healing practice Rebecca had once dreamed of establishing. The pain didn't disappear. There were still days when Rebecca's old injuries flared up, when memories of James and the trauma she'd endured cast shadows over her spirit. But Finn was there, steady and patient, carrying her through the darkness until light returned, and there were new joys to balance the lingering sorrows. The first time Finn told Rebecca he loved her, on a snowy evening as they lay together in the bed they now shared. The day Rebecca realized she had gone an entire week without thinking of James or the terrible night that had ended his life. The morning she awoke to find the first crocuses pushing through the melting snow, a promise of renewal and growth. By the spring of 1879, Rebecca was a different woman from the one who had stood alone on her porch the previous summer, isolated in her pain. She still carried the scars, both physical and emotional, but they no longer defined her existence. Instead, they were just one part of a life that was expanding to include new possibilities, new connections, new hope. The town noticed the change. People who had once avoided the strange, sad widow now sought out her knowledge of herbal remedies. Children no longer whispered about the ghost lady in the cabin outside town, but instead brought her wildflowers and listened wide-eyed to her stories of plants and their properties. On a warm day in late April, Rebecca and Finn sat on their porch, expanded now and furnished with comfortable chairs Finn had crafted himself during the winter months. Rebecca held a letter from Finn's mother, the first communication after they had sent news of their marriage. "She wants to visit," Rebecca said, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "This summer if the journey isn't too difficult for her." Finn squeezed her hand reassuringly. "She'll love you, Rebecca. How could she not?" Rebecca smiled, the expression now coming naturally to her face. "I hope so. I want to be part of a family again, a real family built on love and respect." "You already are," Finn said softly. "We already are." As the sun set over Canon City, casting the world in golden light, Rebecca leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid presence that had become her anchor in a world that once seemed determined to sweep her away. The pain she carried would never completely vanish. There would always be scars, always be memories that could darken even the brightest days. But Finn had shown her that pain didn't have to be endured alone, that burdens shared became lighter, That healing, real, lasting healing was possible when someone believed in your pain and helped carry you through it. And in that knowledge, Rebecca Faulkner O'Rourke found something she had thought forever lost to her: peace. 5 years later, the O'Rourke homestead had expanded into a small but thriving ranch. The cabin was now a proper house with 4 rooms, including a special space where Rebecca prepared her medicines and received patients from town and surrounding farms. Finn had built up a modest herd of cattle, and their vegetable garden had grown into a productive plot that supplied their own needs with enough left over to trade in town. Most precious of all was 3-year-old James, named not for Rebecca's first husband but for Finn's grandfather, a gentle man who had taught him to respect the land and those who worked it. The boy had his father's eyes and his mother's quiet determination, and he filled their lives with a joy neither had thought possible. On summer evenings, when the work was done and the western sky blazed with color, the 3 of them would often walk to the river spot that had become their special place. While James chased butterflies or examined interesting rocks, Rebecca and Finn would sit on the fallen log, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching their son discover the world with fresh eyes. You ever think about how different things might have been? Rebecca asked one such evening. If we hadn't met, if you had just passed through Canon City like all the other places. Finn considered the question seriously, as he did all questions from his wife. I think some things are meant to be, even if the path to them isn't always straight or easy. I think I was meant to find you, Rebecca, to learn what real strength looks like. Rebecca smiled, watching as James carefully carried a small frog to show them. And I was meant to learn that pain doesn't have to be the end of the story, that there can be chapters after the darkness. As the sun sank below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land they now called home, Rebecca felt the familiar weight of her past not gone, never gone, but balanced now by the greater weight of love, of family, of a future that continued to unfold before them like the pages of a book still being written. And in that moment, with her son's laughter and her husband's steady presence surrounding her, Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that while pain might be carried for a lifetime, so too could joy, and in the balance between them lay the fullness of a life truly lived.